At the end of his treatise on the sublime and the beautiful, Edmund Burke gives us a short essay on language, on the power of words. And what he's particularly interested in here is the question of how words can have such a powerful effect on us, even though they lack substance. If you think, for instance, of something you see in nature, so imagine that you are looking at the mountains, right? There's some mountains. Well, the simple sight of these things can give you a sublime experience. You can stand in awe of this. You see there that the senses are directly impacted by nature. But words are insubstantial. They don't have that kind of reality. And yet they affect the ear, they affect the mind in very physical and emotional ways. That's Burke's primary concern at the end of this essay, where he tries to figure out, well, how does this work then? Because it doesn't quite seem to fit with his Lockean view. So you remember that he's very influenced by John Locke, and Locke had given us an empiricist account where our understanding of the world comes through our senses. Burke then tries to kind of make sense of this, and he suggests that, first of all, we can talk about three different kinds of words. So the first kind of word he describes is what he calls an aggregate word. Okay, so an aggregate word. And an aggregate word is something that's actually made up of smaller things. He gives the example of a tree. So if we draw a tree here, okay, there's the trunk and a branch. I'll give it some leaves here. There we go, there's our tree. Burke would say, well, if you look at this tree, it actually consists of many different things. There are leaves, there's the color green, there's a branch, and a trunk, and so on and so forth. So that's what we call then an aggregate word. And other examples would be things like horse and man and so on. And the idea is that this is made up of lots of smaller units. These smaller words then can be called simple words. So simple words, and that would be things like, for instance, the color green, which is really just one kind of feature here. They can be shapes, round, square, that kind of thing. So lots of different simple words as well. And then the last type of word that Burke talks about is what he calls a compound abstract word. By the way, all of these are variations on Locke. Locke has a slightly different configuration, slightly different order, but it's actually quite similar. Now, a compound abstract word is a kind of combination of aggregate and simple words. A bit hard to explain here, but let me give you some examples. So if we take the word woodcutter, you can see how this is not just man, right, an aggregate word, but we combine the word man or woman can be a woodcutter too, with the idea of cutting, chopping something down. And so we come up with this compound abstract word. Another example might be something like foolishness. And if we think about this tree here, we might think, okay, tree, climbing, fear, falling, all of these kinds of things together, they add up to this word foolishness. That's a quick summary of the way in which Burke defines the different levels of language. Now, he then comes up with two problems that he wants to discuss in the rest of the essay. And the first of these, so problem number one, is that there's no clear referent for a lot of words. The referent in linguistics is typically the object in the real world that we are referring to. And we know that in language there are lots of words that don't really have a referent. If we say the, for instance, what does that refer to? So this has always been a problem for linguistics. How does language refer to the outside world? But for Burke, it's also part of a bigger problem, which is the fact that when we hear words, we often don't even think of the referent even when there is one. If somebody says the word tree to us, do we really imagine a tree? Do we think about a specific tree? Or does the word sort of register without that mental image? So those are some of the things that Burke is talking about here. And problem number two is, how do we learn the meaning of words? How do we learn the meaning? This is a very Lockean problem again, because Locke is always talking about how our minds are somewhat like computers, which we need to input data into, right? And then over time, the computer starts to make sense of more and more information. So we are kind of like advanced computers where we can also put ideas together ourselves. But we need that data. And if words can function without having a referent or without really referring to things, and also if we can learn the meanings of words without even seeing that particular thing, well then how does that work? As an example, I have never been to Antarctica, but I have a pretty good sense of what it's like. I have, some indication of how it might work or what it might look like. Locke, by the way, when you read his work, he does suggest that some words you really have to experience to know what they are, because you cannot explain them otherwise. If you said, well, the color green, if you try to give a definition of the color green for somebody who is blind, that would be very, very difficult to do. So those are the two problems that Burke really struggles with. He gives the example of how through education, some words are taught to us, and again, we may not at this point even experience them. There's no experience or sensation of them, and yet we have a sense of whether they are good or bad. So if we think of something like adultery, somebody in our youth might say, well, don't commit adultery. Okay, don't do it. It's not fun, it's not good, it's going to lead to lots of grief, and it's bad. But we haven't even tried it yet. Shouldn't we try it first so that we can use our sense experience to tell us if this is a good idea or not? Is this really bad or evil? Well, Burke points out that over time, we might actually find out that some of the things that our nurses, our teachers, our educators tell us, and of course we don't have nurses anymore, most of us, but that's his language. If they tell us that something is bad, later we might find out, well, it's actually pleasurable. Okay, and this presents a problem for an empiricist like Burke, because he has rooted so much of his theory in the basic ideas of, or the basic sensations of pain and pleasure. And we learn through those. So pain leads to the sublime, pleasure leads to beauty. These are very educational and positive experiences. But if we find out that that word that we have been taught is a bad thing, is actually pleasurable, how does this actually match up? Aren't the senses now lying to us? Okay, these are some of the problems that we have to deal with. Well, Burke does provide a kind of solution. It's not entirely satisfactory, but his basic solution is that words affect us, words still affect us, and I'll try to write this sort of out as a summary here. Words affect us through custom and usage. And with this, he tries to resolve both of his problems at the same time. And this is kind of how it works. Because we hear a word lots, right? We might hear the word adultery dozens of times when we grow up. We have an association with it. The word simply calls forth an emotional response. And it does that through the ear, right? So there's still a kind of empiricist account, I suppose, or partial one, because we do use our senses here. But the word affects us because we hear it so many times and we become somewhat like Pavlov's dogs, where we just have an immediate response. What this means then is that a mental image is not necessary. A mental image not necessary or required. You don't have to think of what adultery looks like. Most of us, when we hear the word, we don't, imagine this kind of picture of two people in bed together and so on. Well, let's hope not. So in that case, there's no mental image, but the word simply works. It tells us what the meaning is. And in this way, we have solved the problem of not having a clear referent, and we learn the meaning. This does work over time. There is still this niggling kind of doubt, though, whether this is a good thing, because doesn't it suggest that the meaning itself is arbitrary? It simply comes down to us through the generations and over time, and we accept it as it is. And from that perspective, we're not actually far removed from somebody like Nietzsche, who argues that words like good and evil are merely conventions. So over time, we've ascribed these to different things, but we have to make up our own minds about what is good and evil, and perhaps there is no such thing to begin with. So these are really arbitrary notions. It's maybe also not far to Humpty Dumpty, who talks about making up the words himself and giving them their meanings. So that's the problem then. If we don't have a referent, we can go quite a ways down the rabbit hole and end up with some of these big problems. Now, just to finish up here, there are some interesting outcomes of this way of looking at language. For instance, when you go on in literary studies, you might find that in the 20th century, as an example, you have writers like T.S. Eliot. So you have T.S. Eliot, and you have the Imagists in the early 20th century. And these are writers who are very much in favor of concrete language. We have to return to the image. T.S. Eliot complains about how in literature there has been this dissociation of sensibility. Okay, so this dissociation of sensibility, and sensibility is feeling. And what he means by this is the idea that in the past, when a poet would describe a rose, they would have that sense of smell in their nostrils. They would imagine the color, and the rose would be real to them. But over time, people would write, or they would think, I have to write a poem about love. Love is associated with roses. I'll just write about a rose, or say you're as beautiful as a rose. But no image of the rose actually springs to mind. T.S. Eliot sees this as a huge problem, that the referent is gone. But if you look at somebody like Burke says, that's not a problem at all, because you have lots of poetry that acts perfectly fine without a referent. An example would be something like Sonnet 18. He himself gives a different example. But if you read Shakespeare's opening to this poem, he writes, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." Do you have any indication of what the beloved looks like from that? There is no actual physical description, right? There is no real referent here to what this person looks like. And we have to imagine this ourselves. For Burke, this is not a problem at all. Words can be extremely powerful without referring back to reality. What we can conclude then is that words are powerful for a number of reasons. The first one, and the most important one, is that words evoke passion. They evoke passion without a referent. Sometimes they do have a referent, but they don't need it, or a concrete mental image. You don't have to think up an image or look outside to what it refers to still have a passionate response. And then Burke adds a few other things as well. He says, words give us sympathy. They evoke great sympathy for others. They also are not limited to reality. Not limited to reality. In other words, if we want to describe something metaphysical, let's say, like God or the angels, in that sense we can use words for things that are invisible, that we have not experienced with our senses, which is what reality is for Burke. We can also make up new combinations. So new combinations of things with our words. And if we add this all up, then we have a picture of language being extremely evocative and powerful, and yet it doesn't come to us through the traditional channels, through our senses. And Burke has been able to deal with this by suggesting that over time we become used to the meanings of words, and so the words evoke these meanings automatically.